let's start, and I'll be like letting people in while we are talking. So welcome everybody to the Critical Mental Health seminar series. My name is Małgorzata Reiter, and I'm the head of the Rare Disease Social Research Center at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, the organizer of this seminar series, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Stefan Ecks today. And I would also like to thank Beata Szulemska, who is a doctoral student at the Graduate School for Social Science Research at the Institute, for making it possible, the whole series. And I will pass now the mic to Beata.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for this introduction. Hello, everybody. Hello, Professor Ecks. Thank you so much that you agreed to find time for this lecture. We are all very, very grateful. I will shortly introduce you and then pass the floor to you. So for those of you who maybe don't know Professor Ecks, although I doubt there are such people, Stefan Ecks is a professor in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. He co-founded Edinburgh University's Medical Anthropology program, which is currently one of the world's leading research centers for medical anthropology. Professor Ecks did ethnographic fieldwork in India, Nepal, Myanmar, and the UK. His recent work focuses on an embodied theory of value, global pharmaceutical market, changing ideas of depression, poverty, and access to healthcare, and relations between multimorbidity and chronic medication use. And his publications include Eating Drugs, Psychopharmaceutical Pluralism in India, and Living Worth, the most recent work, Value and Values in Global Pharmaceutical Markets, as well as many journal articles on the intersections between health and economics. Yes, it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to you, Professor Ecks.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a real honor and pleasure to speak to you, and I'm really looking forward to just sharing some ideas from research that I've been doing, but also a lot of theoretical things. It's quite a conceptual talk, but just introducing core ideas of what I would see as very important issues in mental health research with a kind of critical perspective as well. And I'm going to focus on this recent work that I've been doing, which is focused on value theory. So this is a value theoretical approach, and a lot of what I'm going to talk today is kind of trying to explain why value and how value becomes important. And let me just try to share this screen now with you. How do I do that? So, can you see it all right, the slides?
Yes, we can see them.
So now, I'm gonna. So yeah, value comes into mental health in so many ways, and this is actually from a recent panel, actually just last week, where a lot of other colleagues were also presenting on this question of value, why value is so important in mental health, and how value is an important lens to also understanding all sorts of mental health issues. And this particular panel was actually about negotiations of value. So you have clinicians and patients interacting, and that there is some sort of a clash or a conflict or a negotiation of values going on in these diagnostic and treatment processes. And depression has been my main focus for a long time now among the mental illnesses. It's so common, and it's such an incredibly interesting condition in so many ways. And so also I've been approaching depression as a problem of value itself, because depression really is almost a condition of devaluing oneself and devaluing the world around oneself and devaluing life as well. So depression actually appears phenomenologically also as a problem of like, what am I worth? What is this life worth? What is everything else worth? So these questions of value are very, very prominent, I think, in depression. But I would actually argue it's the same with pretty much all other mental illnesses, maybe all illnesses. But I think that's in depression, it's particularly obviously the case. And then you have all sorts of positionalities where valuing differs. So you have physicians and policymakers, for example, they value drugs and first-line forms of treatment very much because they reduce suffering, right? So what's the value of drugs? What's the value of antidepressant drugs? It's to reduce the suffering. But there's all sorts of other valuations. And one obvious other valuation is that the pharmaceutical companies that produce these drugs value them as commodities in a multi-billion-dollar global market, right? So this is where this particular intersection that I've been studying in India is always very prominent. You have these antidepressants as products that have a value in the market, but also that are valued by patients and by physicians for making lives better, for improving health, if it goes well. And the concept that I've been working with is biocommensuration. And by biocommensuration, I mean all sorts of practices that allow value to be measured, exchanged, substituted, redistributed, or stored. So what I'm arguing is really that biocommensurations are all forms of value negotiations that are happening, which are about what makes life better actually, what is valuable in terms of making one's own life better, but they can also mean monetary value and all sorts of other valuations. And this rests on what I call embodied value theory. And the idea is that embodiment structures what is valued. So for example, the human body is has a peculiar shape in terms of the head is up and the feet are down and we have eyes looking forward, and so many of our expressions also are already embodied in this particular way. So up is good, down is bad, usually moving forward is good, being stuck or going backwards is bad, right? So in those terms, I'm arguing that embodiment structures what is valued, and then in turn, to create value, it means to enhance embodied life. So the embodiment also lays down what is valuable in the first place, because it's valuable for a good embodied life. I'm also arguing that all living beings value, so valuing in this particular notion, in this embodied notion, is not limited to humans at all, which actually is something that's implicit in any other value theory that I've ever encountered, philosophical, economic, linguistic, whatever it might be. The assumption is always that it's only humans who think reflexively who are valuing. But what I'm arguing is that valuing is a key function of life itself, and so it pertains to all living beings. It's just that humans have some tricks and some abstractions and some ways of storing value and abstracting value that other life forms do not have. But valuing is something that is more than human, that is continuous across all forms of life. And also, one cannot not value. Anything we're doing all the time is some sort of valuation in terms of this is good and this is bad, and the good and the bad is always related to life itself. So biocommensuration, to biocommensurate, is actually to value. It's just another more complicated word for it, basically. And it's really interesting also to look at the etymology of the term value, because it actually means good life in a way. So it comes from the Latin word valere, and in Latin you can say the salutation vale when you say goodbye, be well. To be well, valeo, I am healthy, to be worthy. In English, there's a lot of words in English language also that still maintain this, the Latin version of it. And to wield is another derivation of value, and that, you know, to wield like a weapon or to wield something to means also to be strong, right? So it's a body that is not just healthy, but also it's a strong body. And finally, it means to mean itself. So verbum valet, the word means. And I think that's also just really interesting that, you know, value itself is meaning, right? Something that we find so important in anthropology always, that it's about meaningful action and, you know, what kind of sense people have behind something. And this is already entailed in the concept of value as well. And I'm currently, I have to say, you know, it works really well in English along with Latin. It doesn't, it's not quite as straightforward in other languages. So I'm working also on looking at value, the language of value and conceptualizations of value, metaphors of value in other languages. And I think it actually works across all of them, but it's particularly clear, I think, in English and in Latin. And you can tell me what it's in Polish later. I'd be very interested, because in German, which is my my native language, it's Wert, and Wert is more difficult to analyze in this way. But yeah, so but I think it works probably across languages. So a general theory of value really is about life, and it's also it's a concept that I think is incredibly useful to work with across the board, not just in the biological, but also in what we could call social life sciences, right? It's life sciences, and they can be biological and they can be social, and across all of these domains you can find value, because all being is value. So, and now, why not just say valuing? Why this word commensuration and then biocommensuration? I think it's just really useful. So for me, this was really the most important conceptual breakthrough that, I mean, one of the most startling, most influential things I've read, and only very recently actually, is by sociologists Espeland and Stevenson on commensuration as a social process. So where they lay down, and apparently this is, so I'm an anthropologist, and in sociology, it's probably, it seems to be much more widely known, because in anthropology, my own home discipline, I've never heard anybody talk about commensuration, for example. It seems to be a completely unknown concept, but I found it, when I stumbled upon it, I found it incredibly useful to think with this. So commensurations are all forms of valuation processes where you have to compare two things to each other, or two actions or two entities to each other that are not the same at all, right? They're very distinct from each other. So an A and a B are these two entities to be compared for which one is more valuable, which one should you choose. And in English, you say apples and oranges, for example, when you want to say that two things are completely, you know, utterly different from each other, completely incommensurable with each other. But of course, apples and oranges are not incommensurable with each other. You can actually compare apples and oranges in, you know, in a million ways, because they're both kind of round, they're both fruits, they both have a vitamin content. It goes on, right? And then, so the question is, you're comparing entities by relevant criteria. And what I call biocommensurations is the same process of comparing that where the entities in question are living entities or aspects of living entities, and what is being negotiated is vitality, illness, and forms of healing. So that's the bio part within it. So basically, valuing means comparing different possibilities for what enhances life more, and biocommensurations just brings this out, that one needs to compare different possibilities, different drugs, different treatments, different sorts of foods, for example. So for what is better, what makes life better. And so the biocommensurate also is, I think, through this in terms of exchanges and transactions as well, right? Because often it's really about one actant giving something to another transactant, and in these transactions, usually there's if A and B are the transactants, then X and Y are the things that are being transacted. And what I'm arguing is that A and B are some sort of living beings or aspects of living beings, and X and Y are also elements of entities that either enhance or diminish life in various kinds of way. And the pragmatic goal in all of this is to make life better, right? But the question is always, it's always so much easier said than done. So valuing means making comparisons by relevant criteria from among infinite possibilities, also within contexts of good practice, and valuing this process of establishing, is this X and the Y that are being transacted in this way, for example, is this a fair exchange? Is this a good value exchange that is happening? They are more or less easy, more or less hard, depending on a number of factors. And some of them are mutual recognition of what is happening here in the first place. Do we both know what we're exchanging? It's about trust between the transactants, transparency of what is being transacted, the routinization of this transaction, forms of institutionalization, forms of expertise, and technological elaboration. So for example, it's much easier to value things that have a low level of expertise and a low level of technological elaboration and a low level of institutionalization. For example, when you think of antidepressant drugs, do they work, or are they worth it? Actually requires an insane amount of expertise and technological elaboration. And to this day, the experts can't even agree on whether antidepressant drugs actually are good value, whereas other things are much more straightforward to value, and lay people, and you don't need to be an expert to value whether the most of the food that we're eating, for example, is good food or not, right? At least in terms of what it feels like in the moment, and also, of course, in the long run, how it maintains your bodily health. Usually you don't need to be an expert, but of course there's also all forms of expertise and elaboration in there. That's what is better? Should you eat kale, or should you eat beans, or should you eat beets? And where it might require an enormous amount of expertise to actually value different kinds of things for just how much they are good for health or not. And 4 more dimensions that I introduce also in these biocommensurations that are important to that come in one way or another. So for example, power differences between A and B, there's forms of unequal exchanges and exploitation, and also deception. Like think of, and again, antidepressant drugs, when there's a sense of that the pharmaceutical industry might say that these drugs are amazing and they're incredibly effective and they have no side effects. And then down the line, you find, no, actually, they aren't at all. And then as patients, to speak back to pharmaceutical companies can be extremely difficult. And you've had also a whole series of, some of the most expensive law cases and court settlements that pharmaceutical companies had to pay were actually about psychopharmaceuticals, where companies would have said that these are the effects of these drugs, and then patient groups, people who are, survivors, people who got damaged by drugs. Suicide was a major issue as well, particularly with SSRIs in the early 2000s. And where there was a sense of, well, there's a massive power difference and massive difference in expertise between pharmaceutical companies and patients and consumers, right? So that's one aspect that is important there. Proximity of A and B is another important dimension in any kind of transaction, because think of market exchanges usually have a total separation between the transactants, but when you think of transactions within families or caring relations, for example, there's almost a mutuality of being in a individuality, so where you are actually partaking of the same substance as, for example, your family members, and where these transactions and the value of what you would exchange in this way is heavily modulated by just how close or distanced you are as transactions. Time is another dimension. So Pierre Bourdieu, another major influence for me, has done this really well, explaining just how time delays in these exchanges and transactions are of a major importance. Or think of Marcel Mauss, classic theories of gift giving, where also the time factor is important, that you do not immediately reciprocate the gift that's being given to you most of the time. Usually the gift needs some time to stay with the person that's received it before the gift is being returned. So an immediate return is kind of rude. And finally, an inner and outer worldly orientations difference, and this is this work by Perry and Bloch, where the short term is all the things that you're doing in the moment, which are about like an everyday forms of survival, livelihood, making life go on, but also economic wealth and good economic standing. And the long-term cycle that you can find in all societies as well is about transcending this somehow. You need to, the value that's being created is not just for that moment, but also, can you actually create value or transfer value from this life to another life, or from your life to your children's life, or across generations, for example. So all of this also is potentially extremely important. And this is a list of 6 questions that I think are always important also when you think about valuations. What criteria makes two entities similar? What's the degree of similarity between them? How are these similarities relevant? Why are these entities similar? To whom are these similarities relevant? And what's the pragmatic operation that's actually being done with it? So almost all the exchange theories in anthropology focus on exchanges, right? But there's so many other forms of doing transactions, like substitutions, compensations, reallocations, but also actually establishing correlations between things that are pragmatic operations that then also influence how things are being valued. And I'm arguing that we've never been comparative. So one of the great ironies about anthropology is that it thinks of itself as a discipline as extremely, the most comparative of all the social sciences. But actually, I would argue also that anthropology has never really thought about what it means to compare, right? There's actually a whole lot of philosophical thinking and analysis that has to go into this question of what do we mean by when we compare two things with each other. And I would actually argue that anthropology has never really done that so far. And one point also, again, that I think is super important in all of this is that valuing is about relevant criteria, but it's so difficult to come up with valuations also because the possibilities of establishing similarities is infinite, right? It's not just 10 similarities or 100 similarities, but it's actually infinite. number. And this is what philosopher Nelson Goodman established, that any two entities are similar in an infinite number of ways. For example, they can be, so what's my similarity to you in the audience now, for example? Like we are far apart spatially, but still, we're both on planet Earth at the moment, and we are probably of similar kind of weight and similar, all of us have probably two hands and things like that, and we're all existing on a Tuesday in November, right? So you can see that the similarities between us could be stretched ad infinitum. Oh, and what is it that limits this infinite similarity is, again, the relevance of the criteria. And the relevance is established, again, by embodied being. It's actually the body and bodily health and the survival and well-being of the body that actually establishes what is relevant among all of these million criteria, infinite criteria that are possible, right? So biocommensurations are value transactions. It's about discovering relevant criteria for biocommensurations. It's about ways of finding measurements also. I'm not going to talk about this much today, but that's also a very, very important dimension of valuing as social processes, to find scales, to find ways of making it quantifiable in non-numerical and numerical ways, storing value, protecting value, transferring value, and also value conversions, right? All of this is part of this. And now a bit more specific and less abstract. When we talk about psychopharmaceuticals, and we have to value and evaluate what psychopharmaceuticals do and whether they are good or whether they are bad, how do we do this? How does this valuing proceed? And we need to establish basically relevant criteria for these value comparisons. So, for example, you have two kinds of drugs, and you want to see which one is better for this particular patient. But you can also say, you have a drug and you have food and exercise and sunshine and, supportive social networks, right? All of this could also be a comparison. Like, what am I comparing then? Exactly, sort of what is best among all of these things in order to get better from conditions such as depression. So you need to establish relevant criteria for these value comparisons. And the list of this is also just an absolute explosion of possibilities, right? The most obvious one is efficacy, right? You would think that so I'm putting this drug into this body, and then this drug will reduce the symptoms of depression after 3 or 6 or 8 weeks, and that's efficacious and that's good, and hopefully the patient will not have to rely on these drugs for their entire life. Maybe they can taper off and come off. Maybe it's just temporary, but maybe they have to stay on them. Who knows? But efficacy seems to be the most obvious criterion for value comparisons. But then you look at this more closely also from practice, and how all kinds of actors are evaluating these drugs. And then that's this explosion of other relevant criteria that come into this equation. So it's toxicity, side effects. Is the causality clear, right? This is this old problem of should we even call these things antidepressants? Do we even know that they have this kind of specificity of action? And, are they actually, has any of this something to do with serotonin levels or not? It's actually an open question in psychiatry to this very day. Affordability, availability, accessibility, novelty, confidence, and use, on and on and on. So this is a list of relevant valuing criteria that again, so I've kind of been expanding this, and the more you work empirically also on different kinds of pharmaceuticals and what they're doing and how they're being experienced and how they're evaluated, this list of relevant value comparisons keeps expanding all the time. So it's always a question also of how do you commensurate all of this? You know, how do you, you know, if in an ideal world, the drugs you give to a depressed patient would be totally efficacious, have no toxicity, no side effects. The causality would be totally clear. They would be super specific. They would be easy to afford. They would be very easily available in any shop, any pharmacy. They would be accessible, on and on and on. In an ideal world, but in the real world, these different value criteria do not line up, and you have to still come up with an overall judgment. You know, am I actually gonna give this drug to a patient, or am I not gonna give this drug? Or as a patient, am I gonna take this drug, or am I not gonna take this drug? And I want to introduce two specific examples of this, of revaluing, devaluing antidepressants, one from Nepal and one from the United Kingdom. So the first example is about this drug, amitriptyline in Nepal. So there's different generations of antidepressant drugs, and almost everywhere in the world. So as far as I know, I've worked in several places, but Nepal really stands out in this regard. Nepal is the only place that I've worked in and that I know of where this old generation, so you have different generations of antidepressants, and there's the newer generation drugs are the Prozac type, what are called SSRI drugs. And those drugs have been standard first-line drugs in pretty much the world over since the late 1990s, early 2000s. And Nepal has been holding out on this. Nepali psychiatrists absolutely love this old generation tricyclic antidepressant amitriptyline. And this is really odd. This struck me as just really fascinating to explore when I was doing fieldwork with Nepali psychiatrists, because why are you doing this? You know, like the whole world is moved on to SSRIs. And why has the whole world moved on to SSRIs? Because amitriptyline is so toxic, right? Amitriptyline potentially is lethal, and it has, among all of the different psychopharmaceuticals in use, it has the highest fatality rate also. So 4 out of 10 deaths attributed to psychopharmaceutical uses are actually attributed to amitriptyline use. So this is a dangerous drug, and precisely for that reason, all other doctors usually avoid giving amitriptyline, certainly in higher doses, and they've moved to SSRIs where the toxicity is not nearly as obvious. And then why do Nepali doctors value amitriptyline more highly than SSRIs? That's my question, right? And then the fieldwork, the empirical unpacking of this black box of valuing of different kinds of drugs entails also looking at what are the relevant criteria that different actants establish for this. And for the Nepali psychiatrists, efficacy, toxicity, side effects, affordability, availability are all also very, very important dimensions to take into account when they think about which drug am I actually going to prescribe to my patients. And the psychiatrists in Nepal see amitriptyline as the overall best, because it's not a perfect drug in their opinion, because there's still this toxicity to reckon with, the side effects are to reckon with, and also it's an old drug. There's nothing new or exciting about this drug at all. But in their opinion, efficacy wins out over SSRIs. Affordability is way better. So these are amitriptyline is much cheaper. Accessibility in Nepal is much easier because that's the drug you can get in any rural pharmacy anywhere in remote areas as well. And availability is so much better. They have this confidence in use because they've been using amitriptyline for so long. And another point is that for them, amitriptyline is better than these new generation antidepressants because it doesn't just treat, in their opinion, mental psychological problems, but it also actually has a lot of action on the body, right? So it gets people to sleep, and it takes care of pain. It's a painkiller as well. This is actually being used as a painkiller in the UK also in low doses in this particular way. And for them, that's a major component of it, where they're saying like, okay, here I've got this drug Prozac, and it's the fancy newer drug, not so new nowadays, of course, either. But so Prozac is the new drug, but Prozac doesn't take care of pain, and it doesn't take care of sleep properly. But the amitriptyline does, and for them, that's a real bonus. That's a plus for them, that the spectrum of symptoms treated is much broader. So that's why overall they feel like amitriptyline is much better. Amitriptyline has been around Nepal for a very, very long time. It's entrenched since the 1960s. So part of the research I was doing in Nepal actually consisted also in, like an oral history of psychiatry in the country, and like, where did you train, and what kind of drugs were you using before, and how have these things changed? And again, one of the big surprises for me was that amitriptyline came to Nepal in the early 1960s already, and has been in continuous use across the whole country. Again, it's the geography also of Nepal, where a lot of remote areas, you can't even afford to have a whole wide spectrum of different kinds of drugs at hand. Like, you settle on one, and Nepal basically settled on amitriptyline, and that very early on. And that was combined with a systematic devaluation of traditional healing, of alternative explanations, of spirit possession, of the evil eye, all sorts of a devaluation of all sorts of other causalities. That other than depression is just a purely biological problem of the brain, and you have to treat it in this way. And spiritual healing, this is all mumbo jumbo and should be avoided. And this is from some training manuals of the United Mission to Nepal, is one of the major NGOs to establish antidepressants in Nepal in the 1980s also. And part of this training was also to, how to communicate that people should never, ever go to a spirit healer or to a shaman with the kind of problems that they're experiencing, because now there are these totally modern, wonderful high-tech drugs available, and inexpensive and modern, and this is what everyone should go for. Yeah, this point I mentioned before also, the way that the Nepali psychiatrists perceive their patients is that they are somatizers. Like, they cannot, this is how they talk about their patients all the time. They cannot reflect on what is actually bothering them. They have no vocabulary for mental distress. Everything is just bodily pain, aches, headaches, stomach upset, and so on when they come to the clinic, when they present, so that they're total somatizers and that they actually experience it. So part of the work of the psychiatrist would also always to cut through the mask of somatization and get down to, well, they're actually depressed, but they have no notion of it. They're presenting with headaches and dizziness and aches and pains, but really they're depressed. And so, boom, here comes the amitriptyline, basically. And, this is precisely also for the kinds of patients that they're having. That's why the Nepalese psychiatrists feel that amitriptyline is so much better. And then there's this irony also that, in the largest study that's ever been conducted on the efficacy of different kinds of antidepressants, this is Cipriani and colleagues from 2018, which was much, much discussed in the media, also in the UK. It was front page news on The Guardian, front page news in The Times at the time, where Cipriani looked at all of forms of different kinds of antidepressant drugs, evaluating them for their efficacy, but also for how well they can be tolerated, right? So this is a study that compares least a wide spectrum of drugs, but only in 2 dimensions. Is it efficacy and in how well they can be tolerated. And Cipriani finds that amitriptyline is actually the most effective of all the existing antidepressants. It's one of the least well tolerated one. Again, that's where the toxicity comes in and all sorts of really heavy side effects that are associated with amitriptyline. But again, the irony is that, and when I discussed this also with the, so I did my first research on this in 2008, and then I came back to Nepal in 2018, and I looked up many of the psychiatrists I was talking to before. So I kind of had a long build up to all of this, and yeah, when this Cipriani study had just come out, and when I was talking with the psychiatrist there in Kathmandu, they loved it. They were so happy because, like, yeah, we've been telling you all along, amitriptyline is the best, and you know, they felt so happy and vindicated that actually Nepal did it right all along, at least in their opinion. And now moving to another case study of how to value antidepressants, and this is in Greyfield in the United Kingdom. So Greyfield is my word. I was working in this NHS center, which is what I call Greyfield Care Center. It's a more comprehensive NHS clinic that also doesn't just include biomedical GPs, but also lifestyle, nutrition, and complementary therapies. And I was working specifically with the LNC practitioners in this. But what's important is that this Greyfield Care Center is located in one of the most, what's classified as one of the most socioeconomically deprived areas in the UK, and with a life expectancy of just 61 years, right? This is below Zimbabwe, and it's absolutely shocking that in the UK you actually have areas where life expectancy of the local population is just 61 years, and you know, health is very, very, very bad. And so this I have to call it Greyfield and anonymize this very heavily because of the ethical implications of this also. So I'm calling this Greyfield, and the Greyfield Care Center. There's one patient from Greyfield who came to the clinic with, she's been in treatment for a long time with the biomedical practitioners, but also more recently than with the LNC practitioners, and that's where I was following up with her. And so Molly, 37-year-old woman, has, she's also being treated primarily for depression and for stress and anxiety. But as it came out in those consultations, she's also having a whole host of other chronic problems. So very, very bad diabetes, chronic foot pain, ganglion, plantar fasciitis, pins and needles. She's got irritable bowel syndrome, diarrhea, constant stomach pains. There's a long history of abuse in the family. She's going through a divorce. Her son has behavioral problems. She's experiencing hot flushes. She has allergies and a BMI of 45. So she's very severely obese. And what came out in the consultation is that, how do you lead your life, and what's going on in your life, and what are the problems that you're actually experiencing? So, because I was supposed to also look at Molly and look at these consultations, because here's a patient with depression, as if that was her only problem, because she has so many other problems and so much else is going on in her life. So one of those things is that she's having up to 3 liters of Coca-Cola instead of eating anything for lunch, because she feels that this is the only way of dealing with her irritable bowel syndrome while she's out for work, and she's afraid of eating, basically. But that, of course, offsets it's a terrible thing for diabetes, quite obviously. But nobody ever explained diabetes to her either. She actually had no notion of just how bad her blood sugar levels are. And she actually did not know that she should not have 3 liters of Coca-Cola for lunch, which also something, it's just, I found this incredibly shocking. I never expected this from patients in the UK. So she also recognizes that her self-care is very bad, that she's not looking after her food and exercise well. But she's also very frustrated about doctors, as she calls it, doctors just firing tablets at me, that no one sits down with her and looks at her case holistically, that no one, just kind of single treatments for all of these single illnesses that she's being diagnosed with. And on one occasion, in one of the consultations, Molly was asked to bring with her the medications that she's currently using. And that day, Molly came in with one of these black garbage bins, plastic bins with her, what she calls my lucky bag of medicines, and she poured it out on the table, and it contained this entire list of drugs: citalopram as an antidepressant, propranolol for the anxiety, but also Imodium for irritable bowel, metformin for diabetes, an oral contraceptive, antihistamines for allergy, omeprazole for gastric reflux, gentamicin as an antibiotic, ibuprofen, painkiller, sage pills, and matcha green tea pills for weight loss. So an enormous heap of drugs that she's consuming on a daily basis, and where it's actually not entirely clear what are the drug-drug interactions, what are the long-term effects of taking this stuff. One of the shocking things for me was also that she's using Imodium on a daily basis, which is really only meant to be for acute diarrhea. But, she has, isn't that completely destroying her metabolism even more than it already suffered? And Molly is not the exception. Molly is actually the rule in this particular clinic. Psychopharmaceuticals among these patients are also routinely prescribed pretty much anyone who came in with any chronic problems in this care center was on antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs or antipsychotics or something like that. Physical and mental problems almost always co-occurred, so you never really had a nice, clean separation between a mental illness and a physical problem. Everything was mixed up with each other. Typically, there were multiple life traumata in people's whole biographies, and often they could also often date back, like when certain kinds of chronic problems really started to become very severe or became very much more worse than they were, more apparent than they were before. And one thing also that I've never really read anything in the general psychiatric literature on this, but anniversary of traumatic events, like for example, the loss of a parent or the loss of a child or the loss of a partner. These anniversary of events actually also often came with periods of intensified depression and mental health problems. Then all of them also had, not all, but many of them also had prolonged antibiotic use. Sometimes they didn't even know why they were still taking antibiotics after all these years. Chronic painkillers were very common. Among the women, reproductive problems were very common. And there's a whole history also of invasive surgeries where sometimes, they didn't go, the surgeries also where maybe a richer person from a richer area of town would not actually have been treated with surgery. So where there would have been a less invasive treatment, but here there were a lot of very invasive treatments, and several times these surgeries were also not successful at all, and maybe made things worse. So how to evaluate all of these drugs that doctors in this biomedical care center actually prescribe, and particularly how to evaluate the effects of this when there are multiple tangled up chronic problems at the same time, because the specificity, again, you evaluate the drugs by how effective they are. And for efficacy, you want to have a patient who has symptoms, and then you give the symptoms are there, you give the drug, the symptoms disappear. So you want to have this beautiful specificity of the magic bullet model that biomedicine promises, but that's actually not the case in these patients in Greyfield, because very few of them actually get better in any noticeable way. So this was one of those shocking aspects for me as well, that also the age group. So Molly is 37 years old, but also already suffering from multiple chronic health problems, both mental and physical. And this is, again, a very typical thing, which, multimorbidity usually develops only much later in life. So it's common to find multimorbidity and also chronic medication use among people who are 70 years or older. And much of multimorbidity usually starts in the mid-60s. But in Greyfield, because of the social deprivation, the multimorbidity and polypharmacy was already very noticeable for patients in their 30s and 40s. And again, that was part of the shock for me. And these patients have been in treatment for a very long time. There's very easy access because it's the NHS, and in the UK, you don't have to pay anything for that. So there's no question of lacking access in any kind of way to medical treatment, but like they're being bombarded with this stuff, with single remedies for supposedly single diseases. And I'd argue that they actually get much worse from all of this. And there's a process, what I call polyiatrogenesis, which is when you have multiple chronic problems and then you're treating patients with multiple single remedies for this over a prolonged period of time. You have basically uncontrollable drug-drug interactions, and also no notion of what the long-term effects of these drugs are, and also very little sense of, can we not also take some of these drugs off maybe? The whole thing is just so messed up. But what would be needed in Greyfield? So, in the Nepal example, I was talking about how psychiatrists are evaluating these drugs, and then how they come to this overall biocommensuration that amitriptyline is the best drug and the only drug that they would prescribe. And how do the doctors in Greyfield evaluate these different kinds of drugs? Well, what I'm arguing is that they don't do this kind of evaluation properly at all, because they don't look at the patients holistically and in an integrated way. And what they should really do, instead of thinking that, oh yeah, I like this this SSRI antidepressant, for example, citalopram in Molly's case, because it alleviates the symptoms of depression. It actually doesn't. And what they really need to do is to devalue the specific etiology model that they're using when they're prescribing these drugs, and they have to devalue isolated treatments, and they need to revalue an integrated and holistic care and non-pharmacological cures, especially with cases of multimorbidity and chronic medication use. So, it's a different, the Nepal example, it's my ethnography of how psychiatrists are evaluating drug efficacy. And the Greyfield study, in a way, is my evaluation of the drugs that are being prescribed to the patients there. And it's my evaluation that there's something massively wrong in the way that they're using them. And again, this sort of would need to be rethought. And, we're talking about valuations and revaluations. Also, how can you find something better? So if it's not antidepressant drugs to be given to patients, what is better, right? And I would actually argue that one of the important starting points, it's not the end point, but one of the really important starting points is to actually revalue patients as a whole person with all of their histories and all of their specific problems, and also the constellations of problems that they're suffering from. You need to see them as individuals again, rather than just as carriers of one particular disease that you can then target specifically. So that would be my revaluation of how I think the Greyfield GPs are actually doing the wrong valuation of the treatments, and that they're doing coming to the wrong conclusions about this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and intense lecture. And I think the comparison is really striking. I would like to open the floor for discussion and questions. You can also post questions in the chat if you want to.
Can you still see me? It's kind of getting dark here.
Yes, you can
okay,
see
good.
Oh, and now I'm back. All right. So the floor is open for questions and comments. All right, we have one question in the chat function. What kind of solution for this patient you would like to propose?
Mm-hmm.
I assume it's Molly.
Yeah, so that's a good question, which is also the one that my solution. First of all, of course, I'm an anthropologist, so in some ways, fortunately, I'm not treating them, and that's kind of. But I shouldn't stop there, obviously, because there needs to be a way of taking this forward. Still, though, I mean, what an anthropological approach to this actually brings out. And I should say also that when I went to Greyfield, this was on invitation of the GPs in Greyfield Care Center, because they actually wanted to have someone to evaluate the work that this lifestyle and nutrition clinic was doing with the patient. So they wanted me to evaluate the work that was going on and basically say that this is good work and that this is efficacious, because they had trouble kind of continuing the funding for it, and that's why they needed some sort of document to show that it's worthwhile. And of course, my conclusion was that this is incredibly valuable, and the work that LNC practitioners are doing with herbal remedies, a lot of attention to lifestyle, but also actually just listening to these patients for the first time almost. It's what they all said, like, it's the first time that someone's actually listening to me, is incredibly valuable, right? So the value that is being produced in this LNC clinic is already in just looking at patients more holistically and listening to them in the first place, before you can even then think about, maybe there are strategies of getting them off certain deprescribing, for example, is a big thing. But yeah, I mean, this is very hard. And the GPs, when I shared this with the results with them, they were not happy at all. I mean, actually, they absolutely hated it. And I've never had such backlash against anything that I've shared from my research before, because they felt like, of course, like they said, like, but we are doing the best. So that we are the experts and we're actually doing the very best we can do for the patients. And what you are saying to us is that we're doing it all wrong. And what would you do, basically? So also, well, I don't know, but all I know is that what you're doing doesn't really work, and you really have to rethink it. So there's a few people also who are doing research on primary healthcare, particularly in the UK, who are, and one of them is Deborah Swinglehurst also. She's a professor in London working. She had a very, very similar project to mine, and a very similar I mean, actually identical. It's we came to the exact same conclusion, like in her case, also multimorbidity, chronic medication use, people not getting better, everything tied up with social deprivation also, clinicians not knowing though what to do about it. So that was her point, is that, and that's what we've been talking about a lot, is like, well, you know, even if a GP realizes that certain kinds of, that there's no value in the drugs that they're giving, yet their hands are bound by the regulations. Like once a patient is diagnosed with depression, then they are bound to prescribe them with antidepressants. They have to, even if they don't want to, they have to. And that's sort of the fix that they find themselves in. And I completely appreciate that side also. Like on the one hand, NHS being free and accessible, but also, of course, like once you, as a doctor, you're actually obliged to give all of these drugs. So they have no way out themselves. But at the very least, I'm saying, like, look, you need to find, the solution also that you're asking for. The solution is to find new ways of evaluating what actually bothers patients and finding new ways of evaluating all of these pharmaceuticals in a multidimensional way also, right? Again, simply looking at, well, this is standard practice to give an antidepressant for this kind of set of symptoms. That's what needs to be evaluated, because there's all of these other criteria that need to be factored into it. And like the longer version of this study also looks at, there are several cases that I'm discussing where the patients themselves would have reevaluated the drugs and then simply stopped taking them, right? One of them said also, yeah, I've been using these antidepressants for a decade. And then I just kind of, I realized it's really not working for me. And then I just stopped. I never told the doctor, but I just stopped it. And I'm feeling so much better now. So, where the patients themselves also evaluate and reevaluate what these drugs actually do to them.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So there is a follow-up question or from the same person. What about responsibility of the patients for chronic conditions? And after that, we have one question from the audience. Mm-hmm.
So the responsibility for chronic conditions. Yeah, that's again a really hard and difficult question, precisely because there you have a classic case of just people being stuck in really, really difficult situations where agency and free, or let's try something new entirely, is just so hard. Like, for example, gray field is also classified as a food desert. I don't know if that's a term that's more widely used, but it's a food desert in the sense of, you want to, in Molly's case, for example, the stuff she's eating is terrible. This is awful food. But what's the alternative? Because she can't even get very good fresh produce just down the road for very little money. It's a food desert, so she can't get that food. And even if she wanted to, even if she had the full awareness of it, and even if she could spend all the money for it, she can't get it. And that is the kind of diminishes this question of responsibility so heavily, right? So when you have these, it's so much structural inequality basically, and on so many levels that where the possibilities for individual agency are just hugely diminished.
Yeah, I think it's really great that you mentioned the food desert issue, because it's a common topic in the States too, where you have only 7-Eleven, and that's the only source of your food in many, or a gas station connected to 7-Eleven. So it's also important. Okay, we have a question from Kami now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Hello, thank you for the whole presentation. As a GP myself, I had some questions, if you don't mind. First of all, I wanted to ask about the clinic in UK. How would you describe the amount of patients that they see? Is it like excessive amounts of patients that come and go during the day? Because one of the major topics you talked about in that part was the patients talking about the doctors not giving them enough time or actually listening to them. From my experience, for example, when I used to work, one of my biggest issues were just overcrowded clinics. You don't have more than 5 minutes to spare to a patient. So I wanted to ask if that was also the case there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And this is, of course, when I talked with the GPs in Greyfield also, this is one of the things that they mention all the time and are very unhappy with themselves. But they're also saying that we just cannot take the kind of time that we should probably take for those patients. And the UK also in international comparisons is, well, you always think that the NHS is so good with, because it focuses so much on GPs, and the GPs have such a important function in the NHS, but actually also in international comparisons, the time given to individual patients is incredibly short, right? The UK has one of the shortest times. It's also somewhere in the 7 minutes on average range that a patient would actually get with a GP. And Greyfield was no exception to that. So yeah, they are just suffering. They're starved for time. They don't have that kind of time. And I was just actually talking to a colleague who's been working in Cuba, and she sort of observed, like, what's really interesting is that in Cuba, the medical system doesn't really have so much money for drugs and for expensive therapies, but what they have is a lot of doctors and a lot of time for patients. And that in her experience in Cuba, they would just have these, consultations, meetings, talking about everything. And she was also like, if I've never studied it, and I've never been to Cuba, but her sense of having studied Cuban clinics is that they're doing so much better. Like these patients, like the ones so she heard me talk about the Greyfield work as well. And she was like, in Cuba, I wouldn't really recognize this quite as much. So that's where we had this idea of having some sort of comparative research on this as well, because Cuba, if that's actually true, when you have GPs who are spending very little on just pumping patients full of drugs, but spending a lot of time talking to patients, if they would actually have better outcomes overall, that would be extremely interesting.
Okay, thank you. My second question was, if I had the time. Thank you. We're talking about picking a treatment for a patient. One of the most major things that we used to discuss, even during my education, was, I don't know the term for it in English, but I'm going to use a similar word, patient compliance, I guess I can call it. Would this treatment fit this patient? Because sometimes you have some patients who would, for example, be better with pharmaceutical treatment. Sometimes you have patients that are better suited for lifestyle changes. Because you cannot, for example, in the patient that you talked about, she has diabetes, she has irritable bowel syndrome, a lot of complex diseases mixed together. It would be really hard to advise her to change her lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because exactly. She would then need to require to go to, for example, for an endocrinologist to change her diabetes medicine. That's why I'm thinking about the GP perspective again, because it's my perspective. Yeah. In these situations, it's better to just refer them, and because it's a really complex patient at that point. I wanted to ask if you had any ideas about this patient compliance.
Yeah, that's of course a super important aspect of it. And actually one of those, I had this long list of value criteria. I should actually add that one as well, that different kinds of drugs have different levels of compliance also, which are tied with just how easy they are tolerated and how, even just how much of them do you have to take, and then what are the experiences of them. And yes, this is, of course, what you just said is what I know from India also. It's the typical answer is that patients have absolutely no time for any kind of lifestyle changes. Forget about food, forget about exercise. The only thing that they have time for is to just take those pills, and that's what they're going for and what they're foregrounding because of that as well. And at the same time, the compliance, my sense was that it was at least sort of in these gray field patients not the main issue, right? So it was not, because often you have this other argument that if only the patients would take the drugs prescribed to them properly, then they'd be okay, right? That was not, in my experience, wasn't really a big issue. They were, when they were prescribed the drugs, they would usually also take them and take them diligently, almost also to the point of like, maybe you shouldn't be so diligent with taking the drugs after all. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would think in terms of compliance. It's not, yeah, definitely also, again, from the GP's point of view, what can you do with a patient like Molly? We can't do the other stuff. At the same time, of course, this LNC clinic was trying to do exactly that, right? So they would also recognize that how incredibly complex it is, and then just try to find one opening. Maybe, for example, we can, just work on your digestion a bit better, give you a more regulated bowel movements, give you more regulated food, just sort of to start somewhere, basically, to build her back up, because she's still young also. And she shouldn't be so ill at such a young age.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answers.
Thank you. And Beata?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for this super inspiring lecture. I have so many questions, but maybe the one that is most important to me somehow is, I'm really curious, and I've read your article about polyatrogenesis. I find it very, very needed like voice in the discussion. So this differentiation between mental and somatic pain, which is very kind of dubious. I'm just curious, like from the field work you've done in gray field, like what was the doctor's understanding of pain, and to what extent they had, because I assume that they have some kind of specialization. And this multi-morbidity and multi-medication prescription is something that I see as like maybe a logical outcome of like Western medicine specialization.
Yeah.
I wonder if this is something that that can be somehow renegotiated within the biomedicine. And another question that ties with this is like, do you see, like, what are the most important obstacles for this re-evaluation within the biomedical model? Because you said, and also Bari's question related to this, so the time that doctors have for the patient is is an obstacle, and like this obligation to prescribe drugs because of the insurance also, like, so yeah, these two questions, so about the doctor's understanding of pain and the possibility of like renegotiation of I don't know, value of wholeness, or this more holistic approach in modern biomedicine.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, the pain, yeah, it's very interesting because Nepali psychiatrists, for them, pain is usually just somatization. They actually think that these patients are not in pain, but that it's all a mask that they speak through the body, basically. And that's why also, again, why they like amitriptyline so much, because it actually works as a painkiller as well. So for them, kind of pain is just a mask. Whereas in gray field, where psychopharmaceuticals are so routinized as well. Pain is also pain, right? So I've actually never heard anyone sort of say that this is stomatization. Like Molly is totally depressed, right? And she's also suffering from anxiety. But those pains that she's experienced, like they never translated this into some sort of stomatization. Like the pains are real, and that's why they put her on all these painkillers as well. And the IBS is real. So it's very interesting to think about it. So I've not so focused on, the Grayfield study. Like Nepal was totally focused on the doctors, and Grayfield was totally focused on the patients, basically. So I can't make a full comparison, but that would be my main sense of this. That definitely in Nepal they would just everything is somatization, really. And your second question, what are the key obstacles to this revaluation? Yeah, I mean, there's infinite different kinds of criteria for comparisons. There's probably infinite obstacles as well, but actually in itself it's a very interesting question that one should follow up on much more commonly, right? Because there's research on obstacles to why people aren't coming to go to a doctor. They need the care, but they're not coming. What can you do about that, right? There's research on that, and you have research also on obstacles to compliance, that patients, why are they not taking the drugs in the way that they're prescribed to them? But there's not really any research yet on what are the obstacles to the revaluation of trying to get to a new sense of how to evaluate drugs in this multi-morbidity situation. So actually that's in itself is just research that's not being done. I mean, yeah, that's probably my answer to your question. This research is absolutely needed, but no one's doing it. I really don't know anybody who's doing it. It's multi-morbidity has been recognized a bit more recently. Definitely it's become much more popular, or much more focused on, simply because also of COVID. COVID really brought a much greater attention to, because the severe cases of COVID usually all have multi-morbidity as well, several underlying chronic conditions prior to the infection. So that has come in a little bit more, but this question of multiple pharmaceutical use in chronic ways for prolonged periods, no one's doing this. That's probably my answer to this, and people should be doing it. So then we would find out these obstacles also much more. Let me just turn on the light. It's getting so dark. A little bit better. Okay.
Thanks. That was a good idea. So we have two questions from Cami and Alison. Cami, you were first, and then Alison, you were.
Mine is a short, basically a response to what you guys were talking about. First, the comparison of somatization between Nepal and UK. It really depends on the patients in Nepal, but most of the time when psychiatrists go for the somatization is when there's not an organic cause for pain. And in the case of Molly, there's a lot of reasons why she can be having this pain. Yeah. So I guess it was on the behind of their minds, I guess I should say. And when it comes to evaluating drug medication, I should call it, there's one that we still use in elderly patients called Beers criteria. That is given by American Geriatric Society, but I myself haven't heard of anything for younger patients, like in the case of Molly. But in elderly patients, we have this evaluation of, okay, which drugs are more important and which drugs are more problematic in these patient groups. So
and trying to de-prescribe also.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's very good, and it's just very, very important, and just should be done much more. But also, I mean, would you sort of confirm this? This is something I've talked with GPs before as well. They, that they feel also that they don't really know how to evaluate the different kinds of drugs when they are being given, so many of them over such a long time, that there's no protocol to actually evaluate these drugs properly, that there's nothing that they can rely on to. And also, this is what Deborah Swinglehurst always says, is that there's no protocol also for evaluating which drugs can be taken off, right? So you just don't know as a GP, and then the safe thing as a GP is just to keep prescribing it.
As a response to that, the problem with patients like Molly is it's all personal opinion. I have to state that as well. But these patients take a lot of specific medication. So we have antidepressants, we have beta blockers, like a list of medication. And as a GP, you don't have neither the knowledge, that in-depth knowledge, or in this case, time as well, to evaluate every one of these diseases that this person has and the importance level of these medication that this person uses. So in an ideal world, if you ask me, it should be done by a council. These patients should be followed by a council, but it is way too much time and effort. But yeah, that would be my response to that. And there's the criteria, yes, but during my practice as well, how many people I've seen use it? Not too many. Especially people in internal medicine uses it rather than GPs.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and Alison?
Hi, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I've just reinstalled a new computer and I don't think you can see a picture. Can you see a picture?
No picture, but I can hear you.
A hand. We can see a hand.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sorry, I got the time zones wrong, so I came in rather late. I'm hoping you will have recorded the lecture and I might be able to hear back, because it sounded really fascinating. What I was able to hear.
There's going to be a recording.
Excellent, yes. So I'm really interested in what was said about the fact that nobody is really doing the research on this sort of polyiatrogenesis, and that there are, in a way, I feel, because I've actually got a long history. For many years I was a complementary therapist and saw many patients who would come along with these stories again and again of how they had depression and a whole list of other physical complaints, which because I was working as a holistic practitioner at the time, I could sort of accept that as being just part of their narrative and their suffering and so on. But obviously I could tell from the way that they were being prescribed medication that this was just not how that they were being seen. Every ailment was being seen in sort of isolated, individualistic way. And this seems to me to have very deep historic roots, and with and sort of, my studies for critical mental health now, I can see this again and again, that I do think there's becoming a better understanding of the fact that the mind and the body and everything is interrelated, and that things like fibromyalgia are becoming more accepted because it's understood that there are complicated concepts. But while we're still stuck in this diagnostic, this sort of this way of diagnosing illnesses as separate somehow from the individual and named diseases as specific categories of symptoms, I think we aren't really going to be able to take that kind of research very seriously. I don't think that research is ever going to be taken with the seriousness with which it really should be. I mean, this is my feeling about it, is it's got very epistemological reasons for why people choose to if not ignore, at least play down those kind of somatic associations that can happen, as you said, things like IBS and depression and so on. I don't know if you had any comments about that. Obviously,
I completely agree with you. I mean, this is absolutely right. This is exactly, that the deep reasons are really this specific etiology model in biomedicine, and with the magic bullet model, so that the diseases are very specific entities, and then you can target them in a very specific kind of way, and there's no notion of all this stuff piling up and getting convoluted and intermingled with each other. And of course, the one irony is also that more traditional holistic practices for example, in India, I've also studied Ayurveda, Ayurvedic healing, and that they have no problem with that. Of course, this is how they operate. They have no problem with that. Of course, there would be all sorts of things, mental and physical problems and stuff coming together, and then they actually have ways of diagnosing it, and they have ways of treating it in their with their means. And again, they are being criticized, of course, all the time by the biomedical practitioners for, well, but you can't really prove this. You're lacking the specificity, and you can't really with Ayurvedic medications also and treatments, you can't really do clinical trials with them, just because the practitioners also say, well, I'm looking holistically at this patient. And then Molly has a very different, she also has depression, but like her depression is coming along with all of these other problems. And I'm looking at her holistically as an individual patient, and the treatments I'm prescribing are specifically for her. And you just can't run RCTs, clinical trials on them. And this is exactly why, as you also just said, that why this never really gets the same sciencey status, and is seen as, that the evidence is kind of poor. But again, I would probably also just say, well, it's a classic valuing problem, right? So biomedicine has found a way of individualizing diseases and individualizing treatments, which then make evaluations of efficacy under very controlled conditions really well possible, right? And the holistic practitioners, they can't do that, and therefore, their forms of evaluation are not seen as powerful as what biomedicine does. But of course, the problem with biomedicine is that it only works within this paradigm of specific etiology. And then if the patient don't fall into this anymore, which now is the case also, and that's why I think so much of this is so incredibly pressing, because patients like Molly are not, this is not the exception. This is more and more the rule. And some of the newer research on multimorbidity also says that it's probably 50% of all patients presenting to GPs nowadays who have this kind of very complex constellation of problems where you can't distinguish mental from physical easily. You can't distinguish. It's not possible anymore. So this single disease entity model breaks down. And again, also in the whole history of discovery of the antidepressants, that has also been pointed out many times over, like how incredibly deficient the research was and still is also on just evaluating the efficacy of the existing antidepressant drugs, because they would say, like, yeah, we're only looking at people in the range of 8 weeks, for example. Did their symptoms improve in 8 weeks, or maybe 3 months, maybe half a year, but not longer, right? And then some people saying, actually, this is a fatal blind spot in all of the research that you've done on it, because you're only evaluating effects in a very short time frame, and you're not looking at the long-term effects, and you're not looking at how patients might be doing after 5 years on these drugs, and they might actually be doing worse on them, and that there's never really any solid study on this. And of course that's, well, because most of this research is also carried out by pharmaceutical companies. They are not interested in complex cases. They select trial participants precisely by, do they only have these symptoms? Is there nothing else? Like someone like Molly would never be entered into a clinical trial, because you can't evaluate any drug, the efficacy of any drug with a patient like Molly. And again, this is not, Molly is not the exception anymore. Molly
She's
is
not an outlier anymore, is she?
Exactly.
She's not an outlier. But what's quite interesting, because I work in the UK, and quite a lot of the research I've been doing is on social prescribing. You might have come across this, and this is an interesting thing where doctors basically, because they'll get a case like Molly and they don't know what to do with it, so they send them to a social prescriber who sort of does the job of finding out things that might be able to help them apart from medications. And but social prescribing is also falling into the same trap of not being able to actually do a very good research evaluations, because it's exactly the same reason. And so it's hitting the same barriers, the same criticism as you were saying about other sort of holistic approaches, is that it's sort of seen as, but you can't, there are too many variables, how can we, it only works in this group and not that group. So it's just quite interesting how you can get around, if we're still thinking in that way, in that very linear way, then it makes any other interventions or any other approaches pretty hard to evaluate.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and that's precisely the reason also why I was asked to do this work in Greyfield as well, precisely because they wanted to have some sort of evaluation, but then you couldn't evaluate the work of the LNC practitioners through those usual means. It didn't work. Although actually I was also asked to, the lead GP there also had this idea that it would be possible. So he gave me a list of like basically Molly, age, and so Molly pops up on this list as she's a patient of depression, right? So single out those mental patients and then look at how they're faring with the treatment over time, maybe half a year or so, and then do they at least feel better? Right. And that was sort of my surprise also in doing this research. I was like, but Molly is not, she's irreducible to depression. It's not going to work. I cannot evaluate anything that the LNC practitioner is doing in terms of alleviating this primary symptom of depression, because there's just so much else happening. And then I thought, is this just a fluke or something? But no, then patient after patient was basically reconfirming the same complex pattern. And you cannot evaluate efficacy in this way anymore. But again, the most important thing is like, but we still really love the magic bullet model, don't we? And it worked so wonderfully for such a long time. I'm just saying, look, the reality is the patients don't confirm to this anymore. You have to find an entirely new way of evaluating drug efficacy, because the patients don't have single diseases anymore. They don't.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for mentioning the magic bullet at the end, because it's also like within my more specific field, and for ours there are a few others on rare diseases. You can't even start with that, having such small groups of patients to conduct trials. So it's also that model doesn't work, not only when you have patients with multiple chronic diseases, but and mental and physical, but also if you don't have enough samples or too small samples even, to conduct that. But thank you so much, and I would like to wrap up this wonderful seminar, and thank you, Stefan, again for your wonderful and thought-provoking lecture, and I hope we'll be able to continue the conversations. As we mentioned before, there will be a recording of this lecture, so please send us an email, and I would like to invite everyone to our last lecture that will take place on January 24th, and we'll have Professor Orkide Beruzen from SOAS University of London, and that's all, I think. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.